All right, we're going to get started. We got everything in working order. Go ahead and have a seat. When I said stand up and stretch, I meant, where you're at, but that's okay. We could do some calisthenics. All right, we're going to talk about several different things, and I'm not going to dwell on some of them very long at all. We're going to go through them rather quickly. Subgrade treatment's one of those things that I'll just tell you straight up, I didn't remember that too much had changed in the way of subgrade treatment since 2020, because we didn't have this class last year. I didn't update my presentation, and I sat down yesterday morning and it's like, oh my gosh, they did it again. They changed a bunch of the cross sections. We're not going to dwell on them, each and every one. We're just going to kind of zip through them. We're also going to talk about proof rolling. There's another thing that it has changed, and it's changed for the better because the wording in there was really rather outdated as far as the equipment to proof roll. We're going to talk about patching. Scott already talked about milling, wedge and level, widening, cleaning and tacking. Cleaning's not going to be a separate subject. We're just going to kind of talk about it throughout as we talk about paving and tacking before paving. Okay. Subgrade treatment. We have 10 different types of subgrade treatments. It depends on where it is on the roadway or on the embankment or et cetera, et cetera. Suffice it to say that of these 10, you probably have or will pave on 6 or 7 or 8 of these types of cross sections of subgrade treatment in your career, definitely in the next 4 or 5 years, depending on the type of work you do, because subgrade treatments are becoming more and more common, even on non-INDOT work. Subdivisions, rehabilitation of county roads and municipalities' roadways, even parking lots. Different ways to rehabilitate. Type 1A, not used. 1BC, chemical modification with cement. 1BL, chemical modification with lime. 1C, 12 inches of 53s in accordance with spec section 301. 1D, 12 inches of aggregate base. Notice that it didn't specify 53s, it's just compacted aggregate base with 2B check geotextile. Type 2 subgrade treatment, 6 inches of compacted aggregate base 53s. In-place compaction of whatever's there. Type 4, 12 inches of 53s again with type 1B geogrid. And there will not be a quiz on this, promise you. I would fail it because I've kind of lost track of what all the types of geogrid and geocell and geo are. So type 5 subgrade treatment, remove 3 inches of subgrade and put down 3 inches 53s, about as simple as it can get. Typically, you would see that maybe on a shoulder or somewhere because that's not adding too much strength. It's just getting rid of some punky subgrade on top or topsoil or something. Okay, let's talk about proof rolling. This is something that the department has changed a fair amount and really gotten more detailed about. So we're going to kind of hit the bullet points here. When proof rolling is specified, it shall be performed with an on-highway dump truck with a minimum tire pressure of 90 psi. Before, it talked about a pneumatic tired roller. So that was really outdated, in a sense. So it's a little more specific here. It needs to weigh at least 33 tons. All proof rolled surfaces shall be covered with a single pass. Operating speed of the proof rolling truck shall not exceed 2 miles an hour. Deflections or rutting in excess of a ½ inch shall require remediation of the surface as directed. If it's in excess of 3 inches, we're going to get a hold of the department's geotechnical engineering division. How many believe that? How many have experienced that? We take care of rutting in excesses of 3 inches on a weekly basis on jobs, okay? But this is what the department wants us to do. So know that it's in there. These specifications can be your friend as well as the thing that somebody slaps you on the wrist with and says you need to do it this way. So know that it's in there if you need to use it. Proof rolling shall be performed after remediations. Again, you don't just do the remediation and go, oh, it's good. You got to prove that it's good prior to putting any additional material on there, with 1 or 2 complete coverages, and roller marks, irregularities, or failures shall be corrected. Again, you know, put a lot of thought into that, put a lot of good information in there. That's the first time I've seen that. And hats off to you, department, you did a good job. Partial and full depth patching. We're just going to hit the high points here, folks. Needs to be marked by the INDOT personnel. I'm bringing in some personal job experience here. This has changed over the years. It all kind of depends on who you're working with. You know, we have times where at the pre-construction meeting or after the pre-construction meeting, well, before we actually get out and start to proceed with the job, you know, the department wants us to go out there and mark it. We're supposed to be doing it together, or the department's supposed to be doing it. I would suggest partnering up. There's traffic control oftentimes that needs to happen. Oftentimes also, the old patch list was put together and not checked from 2 or 3 years ago when the job was scoped, and so the patching very likely will have grown. So you need to kind of know what you're going to have to patch and what it's going to look like, and do that together. You're going to patch with 402 mixtures. In other words, it's not going to be plate sampled, and it's not going to be density controlled by cores. If you're using a mix that has an MAF, a mixture adjustment factor, which is very unlikely that you will, it's not to be applied to how you're paid. Typical sections, and we're going to see a picture of this in a moment. Typical sections are generally given. This is the patching cross section we want you to attain. You're going to get paid by HMA patching type A, B, or C. And I like to throw this out there for folks that haven't maybe been doing this very long and might be bidding work or whatever. Remember, you have to include the cost of excavation and hauling that stuff off in that pay item, HMA patching type A, B, C, whatever. Here's a typical cross section that would show a patch. There's a 2.5 inch overlay of 19 millimeter and 1.5 inch of surface, but then below that it's showing the existing pavement. And in this particular example, they want you to go down an unspecified depth here. It's not detailed out, but they want you to go down below the existing subbase. Just a typical patching section, what one might look like in the plans. Let's talk about widening. Again, 402 mixtures. It's not density controlled. It is not plate sampled. Again, no MAF supplied. Typical sections will normally be given. They're going to give you a width, they're going to give you a depth, tell you the materials they want you to use in the different layers. It's paid again, HMA widening type A, B, or C. And again, the cost of any excavation for that widening is included in the cost of the item. If you're widening and whatever you're widening decreases to a width of 3 feet or less, you need to use a trench roller. I think it was Nathan said earlier, he's been on a lot of jobs and hadn't seen one yet. Typically they're 3-wheel. One's kind of offset for balance, and the other 2 wheels are in the trench and will be what helps get your compaction. And they specify the roller passes typically for widening according to what you're laying. You probably can't see this very clearly, but here are some typical cases where you may need to do some widening. And in the middle 2, the top and the bottom are typically just widening. The middle 2 you'll actually see on the right side of the second picture down, on the left side of the third picture down. There's also a little bit of a, I'll just call it what it says it is. It's a wedge up there on that pavement. You know, there are places where a wedge or wedge and level is necessary. We have had an ongoing dialogue for quite a number of years with the Department of Transportation as contractors, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the actual widening bullet points. But you'll see, you know, you'll be given a detailed picture in many cases, what the intent is as far as the widening, but just know that oftentimes when you're widening an existing road, to a certain cross section or a certain cross slope, it's not going to match up real well with what you've got there, so you may need another tool in your toolkit. Brings me to one of my top 3 favorite subjects, which is wedge and level. Wedge and level, specified in section 40207B. You can look it up, it's like 2 sentences. There's not a whole lot said about it. Also, what it does say, coarse aggregate angularity, CAA, does not apply when wedge and level is to be covered by intermediate or surface. That's a mixed design requirement. You don't have to worry about having specialized aggregates so your tires get good skid resistance when you're doing a wedge and level. Bullet point number 3 is entirely mine. This is my take on what's happened over the years, and I know Matt will agree with me because we've had this conversation many times. Wedge and level in the early part and probably even some in the middle part of my career, which I've been doing this since 1986, wedge and level was overused and abused for a time. And one of the places it was, one of the points in time when it was overused and abused the most was before INDOT began wholesale milling. You know, we used to overlay a lot of roads without touching them with the mill. So a lot of times, you know, we ran into the conditions exactly like you saw in those previous pictures, and the only thing you could really do to get some decent shape out of the road and then put an even final coat on it was to do a wedge and level. But it was overused and it was abused, and the federal highway basically saw the, in all honesty, tens of thousands of tons some years that were switched from QC/QA mix to wedge and level and not tested, you know, for density, and no plate samples were taken, et cetera, and you know, they in the department said we got to kind of slow this down. And a lot of things in my career, I've seen the pendulum go from the middle to the clear to one side and then clear back to the other, and that's kind of what happened here. We were way over here and it was being used too much, and then we went way over here and we didn't use it at all, and now we're swinging back down towards a nice happy medium. The department, clear up to the highest levels, many meetings that we've had over the last few years especially, you know, we need to get this item back in and used where it needs to be used. For many years, what has happened is they've placed variable depth intermediate or variable depth whatever, and when they put that in there, they don't put a lot of thought, whoever's putting those words down or, you know, filling out that cross section on the drawings, and they don't put a whole lot of thought into what they're really asking you to try and do, and in many cases, you're violating the thinnest lift that you should do and try and get decent density and good compaction, or you're violating it on the other side where it's too thick. You need to put something in there to take up some of that wedge, some of that space, so that your final layer or your next 2 layers can be a nice uniform thickness and you can get good density. Anything the department would like to add to that? And one of the classic examples, and we'll all run into it somewhere this year. You'll go to Miller Road to the depth that it needed to be milled, and you'll have scabbing, slabbing, you know, you'll have an uneven surface then due to the underlying conditions that you have to lay on. What do? If you drag QC, QA, whatever intermediate or surface on there, you're going to get paid for the QC, QA like you were out doing 2,000 or 3,000 tons a day and putting it down at a full depth. You're also subjecting yourself, once you reach whatever that magic number was for plates or cores, you're subjecting yourself to a lot of risk there. If you go out and you try and overlay it all in one lay, you're going to be going over humps and you're not going to be as thick in places where you've got a scab of milling that didn't come off. And even worse yet, where you have dips in places that popped out, places that were rotten, et cetera, you're going to be filling that in all at the same time, laying one smooth pass over it with a 10 or 12 or whatever width paver screed, and then your rollers are going to bridge over that. And you're never going to get good density in those lower areas. You're never going to get as good a density. You're probably not going to get good density, and it's going to be subject to permeability, and you're going to be subject to early failure. So the department loses, the traveling public loses, and all the public remembers a year or two later is, well, those people with that blue and white M on their truck, or those people with that little man with the shovel on their truck or whatever, they did that road a couple of years ago and it's already fallen apart. We don't want that. The department doesn't want it, and the traveling public doesn't want it. So there's a case where wedge and level needs to be used. You need to fill those in. So we've talked about it a lot. It's going to happen. It's going to get back. That pendulum's going to swing back where it needs to. The other thing is, here we go, 1.5 to 6 times the maximum particle size shown on the DMF. I always try and help people remember it this way. Whatever material you're laying, if you're laying, a 19 millimeter, it's allowed to have a little bit of 25-0 in there on the gradation chart. So whatever material you're laying, the next mix size larger than that is that maximum particle size. So if you're laying 19 millimeter, that would be 1.5 inches, because your 25 millimeter is 1 inch. So that's how I always remembered it. 12.5, same thing. Your next particle size up would be 3/4, and so on and so forth. That's how you kind of figure out what does that mean. And then, of course, pay item would be HMA, wedge and level type A, B, or C. Incorrect and correct ways to go about wedge and level. We're not trying to perpetuate the dip and just bring it up, okay? We're trying to fill it in 2 or 3 layers or however many it takes so that we have a good, consistent, smooth layers of pavement. Same thing, just a different cross section. Crown wedge, same deal. If you had tried to overlay the center and carry it all the way out in one lift, you wouldn't be getting a good ride, and you wouldn't be getting even compaction out there where you're laying excessively deep in one pass. Next subject, tack coat. I love this picture for a couple of different reasons. Really good coverage. We've got that 95% coverage that Nathan talked about earlier that the spec changed to a few years ago. But, here we go. We got a tack driver. He's getting right up towards the end, and he kind of lost focus a little bit. Look at the left side and look at the right side. All right? I bet if you go back behind 100 feet or 100 yards or a half a mile, he's probably done a beautiful job, and he's starting to drift to the left. And my question is always, do we think that guy really went back and filled in that little bit over on that right side? Probably not, unless somebody told him to, okay? And that's what we need to start doing more of, is making sure that we fill in those little gaps, and we have to do it right. Tack application, there's 3 different materials you could use: SS1H, AENT, PG6422. None of this is new. It's been around for a good while. Again, Nathan hit on this, so I'm just going to speed through them. No foreign materials deemed detrimental by the engineer. No standing water. Clean to dust, debris, and any substances that will prevent adherence. That dust part, that's a little bit subject to interpretation. There's no such thing as a perfectly clean construction site, but you got to do your best. Application rate, the goal is 95% uniform coverage. We talked about that. We've got to allow time for it to break into set. Nathan covered that rather effectively. Breaking is when it changes color. It's starting to evaporate some of the moisture, some of the water that the tack particles are suspended in. Setting is when it's basically on its way to or is dry, and you're going to have a lot less pickup if you get it out there and get it applied and give it enough time, given the conditions that you have, for it to break and set. And ponding, streaking shall be corrected, and we're going to see the tack application rates on the next page. Tack application rates, the surface type, what are you tacking? New asphalt, existing asphalt, milled asphalt, or Portland cement concrete pavement. You'll see the application rates there. Why does it take more gallons per square yard of tack on a milled surface than on a non-milled surface? Thank you, more surface area. When I'm trying to get this picture across to people, I say, okay, if you take a 1 foot by 1 foot or 3 foot by 3 foot section and it's perfectly smooth, this is how much surface area you have. Now, if I wad this piece of paper up, okay, and spread it back out, I got all these little high points and low points, but it's still 8.5 by 11. I've got to cover more surface area. The other things have to do with porosity. So the department's done a good job working with industry and trying to come up with these application rates. If you shoot in these areas, you should be fine. This is the part where I'm going to depart from the slides, and I'm going to say, I've been in this since 1986. A few of you may have been in here longer. Quite a few of you not quite as long. I will be the very first one to tell you I was taught a lot of things by some very, very, very good men and women, and some very well-meaning men and women. And I was taught some things that we now know there's a better way to do it. This is one of them. There's never, and I'm going to say it again, capital letters, 3 exclamation points. There is never a condition where you're laying a layer of pavement on top of another layer of pavement of any type when you shouldn't tack. Never. How many people in here were taught, well, we just laid that this morning or we just laid that yesterday, it'll be fine? Okay? Again, 30 years ago, our mixes and overall binder content more resembled what we're laying today, and that's probably why we could get by with that. We had more asphalt on the surface area of both lifts, and it helped stick each other together a little bit. But listen, liquid asphalt technology has changed. The way that it's made has changed. Our mixes got drier for a time. Now they're back where they really should be and similar to what they used to be. But guess what? That is not the thing that's gluing those pavements together. You need to have something glue it together that is like glue, and that's what tack is. It helps you with your shearing. It helps you with loads and the pavement moving and trying to stay integral. I always use this analogy. A piece of plywood 3/4 of an inch thick, okay? A piece of plywood 3/4 of an inch thick might be made up of 5 or 6 or 7 layers, okay? There's not probably too many people in here, if you had a 12-inch by 12-inch square of 3/4 inch plywood, could take it in your hands and snap it. But take out the glue, and what do you have? You have several layers that are not glued together, and if you can't snap it here, I darn sure bet without too much effort, you can snap it over your leg. Why? Because it's not glued together. Whether we're laying on something that somebody else laid 25 years ago or we're laying on something that we laid yesterday, you have to glue that stuff together. We had a state inspector. Well, actually, he was working for the state, but he was a consultant. I got called down to southern Indiana about 4 or 5 years ago. The consultant told us that we could not tack on our OGs to put the next layer of base on because we were going to clog up the OGs with tack. The sad part about that was he had worked for a contractor for many, many years, and he had been a paving foreman, he had been a superintendent, he'd even bid work, and he knew, but he had some wrong ideas in his head. So I went down there, and I'm going to call him Bob. It wasn't Bob, and I said, Bob, I've been given presentations for many years now saying there's never a condition when you don't tack. Well, not on my job. Okay, Bob, we're going to attack this a little different way. Open grades have about 3 to 3.1, maybe 3.2% asphalt on them. And they have a void structure of 15 to 21, 22%, something like that. How are you going to spray enough tack on there to fill up all those voids? Well, I guess that'd be pretty tough. You'd have to flood it, wouldn't you? You darn sure would. You'd have it running out in the gutter. And one other thing. Why would you take a layer of pavement that has less asphalt than any other layer of pavement and not stick it with tack to the layer that you're getting ready to put on top of it? Okay? He had some wrong ideas. He was taught wrong. We now know there's a better way. Okay? Wedge and level. Some of us, we're in that era when, you know, as my dad would have said, we crapped in our own nest. You know, we ruined a good thing. We overused and abused it, and then they took it away. Well, now, you know, we need that tool, so we fought to get it back, and we're going to. Surface preparation, all of these things. It's, you know, there's a spec book full of terms and terminologies and rules, but, you know, this is probably 90% of what you really need to know to go out there and do these things effectively day in and day out. I had a young lady come up to me after I spoke this morning and ask me to be sure and put that little blurb in there about gluing all the layers together. And I said, every time I talk about tack for the last 15 years, I've said the same thing. But if I forget, you remind me and I'll say it before I sit down because it's so important. So teach the people that you work with, you know, not just the how, but the why. Because when they understand the why you need to do it, then they'll do it. Anybody got any questions? Yes?
Back to the proof roll. Is there a difference with proof rolling with the dump trucks with super singles versus the wheels?
It doesn't say anything about it. Now, you've got a good point. He asked, is there any difference between proof rolling with the truck with super single, the big wide tires one, versus duals? You got a really good point. Probably should be. I will say the other thing that I didn't put in these bullet points, I kind of forgot. If you're proof rolling asphalt, it's basically the same stuff, but the tire pressures change down to like 75 and 80, something like that. But it's not addressed. It should be. You know, we've proof rolled with a variety of things over the years and done a good job. You're trying to say, okay, I'm going to hold up at least long enough to get paved, you know, and then you've got some real strength. That's the important thing. We've proof rolled with graders. We've proof rolled with, you know, loaded triaxles, you name it. But yeah, you've got a really good point. If you've got a dump truck out there with big wide front tires and super singles on the back, it's going to spread that load more than, maybe they need to consider modifying that spec a little bit, being a little more detailed. I don't know. So yeah, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, somebody had one?
Just a question on how does that tacking work with patching if you're doing patching, specifically full depth patching?
Full depth patching, when you're putting layer on top of layer, obviously it's going to be a little bit stronger if it is tacked. The difference there is when you're full depth patching, especially on your smaller patches, you're typically confined and you can get decent compaction one layer on top of another. I will say that if our folks are patching in a situation where they don't have to have everything brought up that night and they only get the one layer of base in and they're going to do the next one the next day, I certainly like to see them tack it. It's going to be better. Oh, and I'm really glad you said that, okay? This is not part of the presentation. It's just me sharing some real-world experience and maybe saving you a little bit of pain. Patching. INDOT in 2023 will be measuring smoothness 100% with inertial profiler. Inertial profilers catch an awful lot of things that a profilograph does not. We've done a lot of experimentation with our machines and measured a lot of things over the last couple of years. And one of the things that you're going to find is you're going to have to do a lot better job of getting good compaction on your patches because they will reflect through. Traffic will have them. You'll do your surface, especially in the heat of the summer. If you did not get good compaction on your patches, it'll show up as an area of deduct in that 1/10 of a mile segment on an IRI. Wouldn't necessarily show up as a bump or something with a profilograph, but we've got to really be careful when we're patching and we go around and we're measuring those jobs for smoothness. We've seen that this season. Anything else? Thank you.